Welcome to Harmonious Workplaces, a podcast about corporate culture, organizational change management, and workplace behavior. Harmonious Workplaces was started by two independent consultants, Rich Cruz and Ben Kleinman, to explore, challenge, and build on various organizational culture and change management concepts. It's a blend of theory and practice based on their personal and professional experiences working with companies of all sizes across various industries.
If you own a business, lead a team, want new ideas about the corporate environment, or just want to sit back and listen to two guys talking about how to make work more enjoyable, we invite you to relax and dive in with us to Harmonious Workplaces.
Welcome back to the Harmonious Workplaces Podcast. We are on episode 4, and today we're going to be talking about practical tips to implement change. So over the last few episodes, we've shared a lot of theory and higher level ideas around why you might want to change, why change is hard, and why it's important to create a culture of safety when embarking on change. And today we're going to boil these ideas down into a handful of practical tips you can use to make any change initiative go smoother. So again, my name is Rich Cruz, and I'm joined by my co-hosts here.
Ben Kleinman.
And
Sharyl Volpe.
And we're here to talk about some of the practical tips to implement change. From our last conversations, guys, any thoughts, insights before we dive into today's conversation?
Sharyl, anything jumping out to you?
Just that I am thrilled that we started talking about change and how difficult it can be. I think that everyone needs it, and I think the tips that we're bringing to the table are practical and hopefully will bring about change with regard to implementing change.
Yeah. Well, and last time we talked about a bunch of like theory, right? And we've even in the first two episodes, it was just, it's a lot of, kind of lofty theory, but I think adding some actual how-to stuff into this really brings it all together. And Ben, you've been doing this for quite a while now, so with lots of experience. So can't wait to hear some of the stuff that you're gonna share with us.
Yeah, no, it's fun, and I don't know that there's anything super earth-shattering, and we've kind of woven some of those themes into our prior episodes as well. So it'll be interesting to see where we go in terms of trying to bring all that together. I think, Rich, you were saying earlier when we were just kind of chit-chatting that there's all these sort of metaphors and sort of sayings and all that kind of stuff that just kind of the type of stuff that when I see an article or some sort of thought leadership post from one of the big consulting agencies, it is a lot of very, very like sounds good soundbite kind of stuff. But when you try to break it down, like enable your organization for change, or ensure that your organization is able to carry the through line of change. I love that. That's a great soundbite. But when you try to unpack that and as a practitioner actually do that, you start to understand that it's a lot more complicated than just plugging your computer into the wall and having the battery start charging, that there's just so much there. And it makes your head spin. And so I think one of the things that I always find is a little bit deceiving about some of those types of things is that a lot of times the theories and the ideas and the sort of simplifications make it seem like change is easy, or change is just as simple as sort of mapping out a to-do list for your daily activities. And at least in my experience, it's often not. And I think that what surprises me is that people find change so difficult when they get into it, because I think they just underestimate, or they don't even realize that it's its own thing.
Right.
How does that resonate with you guys? What do you see when you look at that from an org perspective?
Well, Cheryl, you've been through some changes in your career, especially in the last few years, right? Any thoughts on some of that?
Sure. Thank you, Ben and Rich. Yeah, no matter how many theories or ideas or this language that is compressed into these sound bites and these easy takeaways, it comes back to the people that have to go through this change. And we have said many times in our podcast here that communication is key to that. And how often is it that change is thrust upon the organization without that communication and without the reason why? And
Right.
that is your first obstacle right there, right? If you can't let your people know the reason that they have to go through this discomfort or unfamiliar territory, it's critical to get that communication straight. And that's often overlooked. And in my experience, that has been probably the biggest setback with any change, is that first amazingly important step to bring everyone together and say, we're about to head into something that may be new, different, or uncomfortable for you, but here are the reasons why.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
And go ahead.
Well, there's. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Ben.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's almost like if you don't get that part even close to, you don't have to get it perfect, but even if you don't even acknowledge that part, you've already set yourself back weeks or months, and you're starting off this journey on such a rocky footing if you don't even acknowledge that part of it has to be there.
Yeah. Or even try. If you don't even try.
Yeah.
A cynicism sets in right away.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it seems like that's the most natural thing in the world. Like if you were doing something with your family, you're going on a trip or whatever, you'd say, well, we're thinking about going to XYZ city. You guys want to go? Yeah. What do you think? What would we like to see? Would we like to spend more time doing outdoor stuff or indoor stuff? Do we like fancy food for dinner or just like simple food and kind of get on with our day? I mean, all these things that you kind of take for granted, but nobody does that in the workplace when you're embarking on these $1 million change initiatives.
Right. It's like taking your family into the car and they think they're going to the grocery store and you're hopping on the turnpike, right?
Yeah.
Blindfolded, thrown in the trunk. Yeah. Sometimes it's more like it, right?
Well, that's a whole different thing here.
It's a whole different thing, but yes, well, I suppose that's right. but the reality is that people do feel like, if they're broadsided, that they're hijacked, I mean, and they're stuck having to do this, and that fight or flight response really does kick in, and we see people resisting, or conversely, you see talent exit en masse. I've seen this happen, in several organizations in the past, and we hear it in the news all the time. You either have people who aren't going to get on the program, and they're going to resist until the point of where the organization's like, well, we're going to lay you off or fire you, or you're going to be looking at another job, and leaving you on their own accord, so.
That is so not what I thought you were going to say.
No?
When you started with people who are resisting,
yeah,
I was thinking you were going to say, on the other hand, there are people who run to the change and try to get it done as soon as soon as possible, and just try to like plow through it. Like, I don't know, when you're shoveling snow and you say, okay, I just got to get this done because my Ted Lasso is starting in 10 minutes. So you just power through it, and you don't care if you're hurting your back. You don't care if you're throwing out your shoulder. You don't care where the snow is going on the neighbor's yard, over the dog, whatever. You're just like, I got to get this done. And that has its own problems when you're trying to sort of clean up the mess, and like apologize to your wife is apologizing to the neighbors, and your daughter's cleaning off the dog, and it's like, well, you've now just shoveled out the flower beds for next year, so there's going to be problems there. I mean, all those things. It's like the flip side of that, but also, now you have resistors who are sandbagging. You have people leaving, like you were saying, or thinking about, or silently, what is it, the quiet quitting now that's a thing. And now you have this like people just bull in the china shop type approach.
Well, I guess, yeah. And you make a really good point. That's right. I mean, there are people who just, they just plow through it, like you said, without really thinking about what they're doing, without aim, without purpose, I guess where I was going is actually there was an article earlier this week about this like quiet firing where there's, when people are not living up to expectations according to changes that have happened in the organization, i.e. return to work to office, right? Or some of the other kind of, mandated cultural changes that are happening, when those aren't being adhered to, where they're making it hard for somebody to stay, or they're reducing benefits or time off, or other things. So I can't remember exactly where I read that, but it was in one of the magazines that I was subscribed to.
So the idea is that they sort of make it too uncomfortable for you to want to stay.
Yeah, that's kind of where this kind of quiet firing thing happens. So it is passive aggressive, and it's a toxic environment that nobody wants to be part of, and it's cheaper to do it that way than arguably than to do a layoff, if that makes sense.
Well, you wouldn't have to pay severance. You don't risk lawsuits, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I guess that's where my mind went with that one. However, to kind of bring this back to what we were going to talk about this time, right? The nice part is that there are some tools and techniques and things that can be done to make change actually happen, right? So, we, as we said before, 42.1% of people report being highly overwhelmed by constant change. That is a totally made up number, by the way. Like, please do not say, "Hey, the Harmonious Workplaces podcast said 42." No, we're just playing there. But still, there are people who are moderately or slightly overwhelmed, suggesting that some 85% of your colleagues have no or little bandwidth for change right now. And does that mean that we're doomed to fail? Not necessarily. Over the last few episodes, we've shared a lot of change theories, like we said. But let's take a look at how we can put some of those into practice. So, who wants to start there?
Well, also, I was just reading something about, of course, AI and generative AI, and there was a quote, and I'll send it to you guys, and maybe we can put it in the show notes. But it had to do with a really great leader's perspective on how to bring employees along on that transformation for their organization to get them comfortable with using generative AI, with, I guess, first understanding the power of it or how it could be used in their company, giving them the opportunity to learn about it, train on it, see where it could fit, kind of co-create the future of that company using generative AI. So, I mean, that's a very technical, specific example. But what I loved about it was this leader's perspective of, it's all about our people and bringing our people into the conversation and helping our people co-create what we want to be, as opposed to just forcing this technology change on them. So I think there are some people who are kind of getting it and trying to make change and crazy transformations as positive as possible from the get-go, to go back to it, Sharyl, what you were saying, in terms of starting off from the beginning, very intentionally saying, we're going to try to do this as best as we know how and do right by our employees the best we know how from the start. And that includes being open and transparent and acknowledging what we know, what we don't know, what we think we might want out of it, what we know we don't know, where we might get out of it, what we know we're not going to do, like we're not going to incentivize bias or unethical behavior or egregious risk taking, those kinds of things. And so it was a really nice thing to see that sort of stood out from the usual, we're embarking on a change and we think Gen I can help us supercharge our earnings for next year and blah, blah, blah. But this was really cool.
Sure. I can't wait to see where it goes, because we are not just, the C-suite in the world seeing AI and, bringing it into a company and having the company adapt to using it, but the leaders, it's sort of being handed down to them with no choice. Almost, it's almost like the internet was everywhere when it became everywhere, and nobody really had a choice. So you see the leaders who are the stages of grief, going back to that, the model that is also related to families going through grief, that first stage of denial, right? The companies who are in denial with AI and generative AI, I think they will suffer because it's not going anywhere. And that is a change that you will have to look at and embrace and find ways to make it productive and keep it ethical too, right? I mean, there are so many new boundaries with what is ethical with AI. So that is something that is being brought, that is change coming from, the progression of our species, essentially, right? And people are still trying to understand what they're going to do with it and how. Where is that communication coming from? And that communication is being shaped by every individual practice. You can take it and shape it any way you want to bring into your company, essentially, at this point. How are you going to message that as a leader and position it in the company, right?
Sure. Well, I think that's one of the missing elements that I think a lot of change models have. Frankly, just looking at the 9 I recently learned, including ADCAR, and we talked about the ADCAR from ProSci and some of the other change models, right? We talk about vision, we talk about communication, we talk about getting people on creating these coalitions and all that. But what I think one of the things that we do oftentimes miss is the stakeholders themselves, the change leader and the higher executives really understanding what we're trying to do, why, in this case, like AI, why do we need to adopt this, other than from a high level, maybe it's competitive advantage, maybe it's more efficiency or whatever. But there seems to often just be this, well, we're going to get on the bandwagon, we're just going to go and do this thing, and somebody needs to go take charge and sally forth with it, So I think there is some level of analysis in that, like before we start engaging in the vision and before we start engaging in those, those other things that oftentimes is missing. So I think about in project management, right? PMI, right? There's 5 process groups: initiation, planning, execution, monitoring, controlling, and closing, right? In that first part where you're initiating everything, right? And you're really getting the entire scope together. How many times in a change process or any project for that matter do we have like scope creep like crazy after the planning process and everything else, So I think one of the things that's worked for me, boots on the ground, is really making sure that some kind of business analysis has been done prior to starting a change, right? Where we're actually going in and identifying some of the KPIs that we can baseline first before getting to the next part. So even before we go and start communicating, hey, everybody, we're going to go change everything and, get on board or, whatever, and life is going to be, happy. Before we start going and doing that, I think there needs to be a really keen understanding, of what exactly we're doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the downside to skipping that step, going back to what Ben was saying, right? If you don't do your research, you don't do your planning properly, you will have people who plow through it and just throw it together just to get done. And then you've got to redo it anyway. If you don't give enough time for each of those steps early on, you will have people who feel they don't have the bandwidth for that change. It hasn't been planned properly. I haven't been trained enough. I don't have the time. I have too many other things on my plate. I'm going to plow through it. It's not exactly right. The leaders have to retool the goal. People have to do things over. And then you get into a real mess. And then everything's over budget. The plan is failing. And you have to spend even more money to fix the things that have been done poorly. So that pre-planning before you unleash the so-called chaos in those early stages, the unfreezing, you have to do that planning.
Guilty. I've been there.
Yeah.
It's a delicate balance though, right? It's at some point you can sort of plan as much as you can and try to understand as much as you can understand, but there's no way you're going to know every single thing. And there's always going to be stuff that comes up. And I think the better experiences I've seen in change playing out in corporate world is when people say, we know the contours, we know roughly which direction we want to go. Maybe it's more narrow than that, so it's not just a free for all, but we know where we want to go. We know roughly how we want to get there, but we don't know every single step of the way. We don't know if there's going to be lots of big boulders that we have to go over, or if it's just lots of steps on small gravel that we have to have different kinds of shoes for. We just know that there's going to be some variation in the terrain, and we have to figure out how best to get over that together. And we'll come to that when we come to it. But we just know that if we don't get to where we're going, then we're going to be even further behind than if we didn't do anything at all. And so it's I think this delicate balance that some companies do really well because they think about it, and they've like you both saying, you've put in that thought ahead of time. And maybe the thought needs to be, as you're doing that initiation or as you're thinking about that analysis step, thinking about more about the contours, more about the direction, more about the intention, and what we were going to be saying we know, and what we're going to be saying are sort of the guardrails, versus trying to have every single step of that project plan lined out and detailed out for the next 3 years. Because there's no way you're going to know what's happening in year 2, month 9. You don't even know what's going to happen in week 2 of the project. So give yourself a little bit
hour
of
or two of the project.
Yeah.
Or an hour or two. We were, I was just catching up with a colleague from the investment bank we both worked at many years ago. And we were musing over the expansion. We both have this very vivid memory. I was doing orientation to new people into the investment bank division, IBD. And there was a moment in the 90s, going back to the 90s, we hired over 100 web services people, over 100 in probably maybe 4 months.
Wow.
This was like leading up to Y2K and all of that.
Yeah.
And it was not long into the new year that the whole division was outsourced to a vendor. And those 100 people were slashed to almost less than a quarter of that in almost no time into the new year.
Oh my gosh.
So that was one of those things. But Rich, you were making me think about, I have my more recent experience in entertainment. If you could workshop in the way that you do a script, a business plan,
okay,
bring everybody in and say, look, over there's the goal. Here are the things that we're thinking. Let's workshop this change that you're
that is a very good concept. I've never tried that, Ben, have you? Because I
was going to say the closest I've ever seen and the closest I've ever done is brainstorming sessions that are maybe a little bit more focused on the vision or the mission of an organization. And maybe the brainstorming sessions are focused on if the vision of the organization, if the mission of the org is pretty straightforward and set, and you're not really changing that, you're thinking about maybe new ways of generating revenue. You might have a brainstorming session with a whole bunch of senior folks coming in and thinking about what are all the crazy ways that we could think about generating new revenue or bringing in new patients or generating creating a new patient experience, right? Whatever that might be. If you're a hospital, some kind of new customer engagement plan or new customer engagement or new customers that we could find out in the wild. And so you have all these people throwing sticky notes at the wall and things like that.
Shared idea generation.
Yeah, exactly. But I've never done that in the context of you're kind of in the real detailed execution phase or trying to line item out what you would do for a product. I've never tried that.
Well, yeah, so typically when I get into a consulting arrangement, right, I try to build in a discovery period where we're actually doing that analysis, and then we may have a couple of sessions where we're trying to gather data and do some of that idea generation within a group, that type of stuff. But this idea of when you're in the planning stage and then kind of doing a table read of the project, right? That I've never heard of that before. I really like that idea because it's
like
a simulation.
Too, yeah.
It really puts you into, well, okay, let's go through this right now.
It invites engagement right away. Everyone has a vested interest in having their ideas shared in that moment. And going back to the psychological safety, I know, Rich, you were touching on that, how easy it is to get in that put up or shut up, that quiet firing, the psychological danger, and stripping that safety away. That's sort of taken care of when everyone is in that table read, essentially. But not always practical, understood. There are people that are leading these teams that have information that's not necessarily prudent to share with everyone to make that necessarily productive. It's not exactly like a script, it is what it is. But maybe that could be something that people, especially in more creative companies, that have to, tap into the group to those things. Yeah. So
I wonder if that's two thoughts. One thing that seems pretty consistent at places is you'll have regular check-ins with project sponsors, usually fairly senior folks. And that gives those folks an opportunity to course correct. And that's a little bit of that, table reading, like you're talking about.
Revising.
Not quite the same co-creation type stuff, but it's a little bit of that. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to try that out when you're on a project where you're starting things, you're sort of going through a phase, and it's almost like that agile methodology where you're doing something in a sprint.
Just thinking that exact thing.
You deliver a package of work, and then you go to your next sprint and you deliver another package of work. And maybe in those interims, you do a little bit more of that table read style, as opposed to just, well, let's pick a few cards and we're going to pick this, and this, and we don't have time for anything else. And that's all we're going to focus on for this sprint. Maybe it's a little bit more of that. Well, let's recalibrate. Where are we? Are we moving in the right direction, and being a little more thoughtful or intentional about stepping back each sprint? Or maybe if you don't do it every sprint, you do it every 4 sprints or whatever. And, it just depends on the cadence of your project. But maybe it's a way to bring some of that sort of holisticer thinking in.
Right. Yeah. You just added a new letter to the acronym Agile. What letter would it be? Something in the sprint. Sprint slow. Sprint slow. We are.
I'm sure that's the last thing that Agile people want to hear.
Right. Another thing we got to add to this thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. So cool.
Go ahead, Rich.
No. Go ahead. What were you gonna say?
You guys have just laid out so much stuff. And if you're on the podcast or watching this later, I assume you're going to have to go back and re-listen about 6 times to get all that. Some of the stuff I heard just in terms of how one might do this in practice, there's themes coming through loud and clear around communication and just being super intentional around communicating. And to me, that means 2 things. One is just boiling it down. So you're talking, Sharyl, about, and Rich too, about executives that, might be flying in the wind a little bit. Just boiling it down. Whoever's leading the change initiative, I think, is probably the most important, most responsible person for trying to get that into 5 words, 10 words or less that everyone on the planet can understand. And it's not just, we have to make more money or we're going to go out of business. That's like too vanilla. It's got to be something that's super crisp, but resonant to your industry, to your customers, to your employees, maybe other stakeholders, shareholders, if you're a public company, that kind of thing.
I think you've said this before. It has to hit them like on an emotional and an intellectual level.
Exactly. Right? It's got to be on that emotional and intellectual level. The why is super important. So there's that communication of the why. Why are we changing? Why do we have to change? And then also, it kind of came through acknowledging what we know and what we don't know, and how we're going to go through this journey together. And we're going to have a path. We don't know if the path is going to be super windy or super straight, but we're going to figure it out together, and we're going to guide you, and you're going to help guide us, and we're going to learn together. And it's about this kind of togetherness. And I think that goes and gives some people that psychological safety that we talked about before. It gives people the space to say, okay, there's a plan. It's not 100% detailed out, but there's a plan. We know where we're going. And I understand emotionally why we're doing this. I understand intellectually why we're doing this. And I understand I'm going to have a chance to weigh in. And if I want to help guide this or even lead this, there's going to be some room for me to get in there. And it's not just going to be a done to me kind of a thing. It's a done with me kind of a thing.
Sure.
Those seem like really crisp things that you guys were getting at earlier, as far as how one might do this, how one might kick off. That's just the kicking off.
That's just the kicking off.
We haven't gotten into any of the other stuff, but
No.
That's just the beginning stages that I think anyone could start tomorrow.
Right. Yep. I agree. Yep.
Agreed.
Yeah. So let's just maybe call this some practical steps for starting change, implementing. I think Ben, you've said something about herding butterflies or something to that effect with all the different types of people and scenarios, everything that could be happening later on. So maybe what we need to do is get into some of the other phases of change and some of these practical steps that we can make. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in next week's podcast. So we'll continue the conversation.
I was going to say that makes sense in this kind of future podcast.
Yeah, because I think right here we've hit kind of aligning people. We've hit a little bit on planning and a whole lot on communication, right? So I think we need to talk about maybe a little bit more on planning, although like you said, acknowledging that things are going to go sideways. They're not gonna follow the plan exactly. So there's iteration that needs to happen. And then talk about some of the measured and controlling and even some of the closing stuff that comes later on in the process. Fair enough?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that might help tie it all together is this idea that I really like, and I've seen it work really well in corporate world, is using stories to personalize the change, to personalize the why, to personalize on an emotional level or an intellectual level why we're doing this. So I do a lot of stuff in the healthcare sector, and it's easy to hook into a patient story. This person is suffering from cancer. This person is suffering from an inflammatory disease. Well, everyone understands, we want to do everything we can to make that person have a better quality of life, or have a chance at an extra 6 months of life before dying, whatever that might be. Those are super easy. In other industries, it might come through differently, but this idea of stories, and it may not even be something like an end user story, but it's just an executive launching a change initiative and saying, we're going on this journey. And there's all these, metaphors we've talked about, going down a trail, or, getting on a boat and sailing somewhere, or getting in a car and driving to the grocery store, or whatever that might be. But just using a story, because people like stories and they're easy for people to remember. And you usually have some kind of a hero, and the company is the hero, or the person who's leading the change in the company becomes the hero, that kind of stuff. And it helps to make it resonate and make it memorable.
That's the truth. Cheryl, I think you can attest to that. You come from a storytelling industry.
I can absolutely attest to that. I have two contrasting examples, though. One is, yes, storytelling in an actual story arc, where everything has to come together at the end, or there has to be a reason for this or that. And then there are stories that sometimes leaders tell that that aren't completely believable too. So it's a bit of a slippery slope. Right? I remember, the story of, let's say, you will be training a team of people who we will be eventually outsourcing your work to, but this will enable you to do other things. This will free up your time, right? And that's a story that doesn't always come true in that way. Sometimes that's a story that a leader may tell just to make sense business-wise, but in practice. And that might be one of those theories going sideways, if it doesn't, in fact, give you more time to do some higher thinking or be more innovative. What can we have you do with that free time? So that was a theory, again, it's still happening, that theory. I don't know that is proving itself to be true in our corporate culture right now.
I think it's a great point. And I think a lot of people are starting to get very good at seeing through that veneer of BS-ery.
Yeah.
Right. So if you are going to tell a story to give context, it has to be carefully designed so that you can be honest about it. Transparency too.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. Craft your message and craft it so it's not crap. Fractured fairy tales worked in the Bullwinkle show. They're not going to work in the real world. Yeah. So, well, thanks everyone for joining this morning, and it's always just a treat to have both of you in my whatever room this is in my house.
Your studio.
Yeah, thank you for
thanks.
For
this was
in
fun.
and sharing
I liked
your
it.
insights.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Cool. We'll see you guys next time. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see everybody in our next podcast episode. Stay tuned. Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Harmonious Workplaces, a podcast about corporate culture, organizational change management, and workplace behavior. You can find Harmonious Workplaces on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter.
And we love any feedback on whatever channel you find us on. Please rate, like, and share our podcast with your network. And remember to add Harmonious Workplaces to your list of favorites to get notified about each new episode. To get in touch with Rich, please visit www.workbalanceconsulting.com. And to connect with Ben, find him on LinkedIn or visit harborsidestrategy.com.